So I've been preaching this sermon series on the Ten Commandments. Our Sunday school students call the Ten Commandments the 10 best ways. And I love that way of thinking about God's gift to us of God's law. Today, the fifth commandment, honor your father and your mother, that your days might be long in the land which the Lord your God gives you. And I want to look with you at what happens to the fifth commandment as the New Testament thinks about it, including this well-known story from the life of Jesus in Luke chapter 2. And when Jesus was 12 years old, he and his family went up to the Passover festival in Jerusalem. And when the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents didn't know it. And assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey, and then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. And when they didn't find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. And after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening and asking questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when Jesus' parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to Jesus, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." And Jesus said to his mother, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house?" But his parents didn't understand what he'd said to them. And if St. Luke the evangelist has something to say regarding the fifth commandment, so does St. Paul the epistolarian, including this passage from his letter to the church at Ephesus, chapter 6. "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother." This is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. "And fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So honor your parents is the fifth commandment. It's not exactly a provocative or controversial piece of advice, is it? Who's going to argue with something so patently obvious? And how is the preacher going to scare up a 15-minute sermon about something so patently obvious? Well, you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't. Now, for the most part, folk like us, this is not our issue, really, is it? Most of our children have this one down pat, right? I remember when my son was a junior in high school, and it was April, so the semester had begun in January when it was 4 degrees, and it would not be over until the end of June when it was 90 degrees, and there they are. My son and his best friend, Bobby, come over to my house to tackle some huge project for AP Psych. And they're in my son's bedroom, and they're very quiet, so I wonder what's going on. So I check in on them after a couple of hours, and there they both are, fast asleep on the bedroom floor. My son's friend, Bobby, was taking about 5 AP classes that semester. I don't know how many it's possible to take, but whatever is the maximum number, that's what Bobby was taking. He played third single on the tennis team and was playing on some USTA travel team as well. He had a small part in the spring musical. He was a madrigal. He had a girlfriend who wanted to see him in person once in a while. His grandfather, his mother, 2 uncles, and an older sister had graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. And so in this family, it was not acceptable to get accepted at an average college like Middlebury. And Bobby was exhausted. You know, he looked like he just survived Hell Week with the Navy SEALs, except this was Hell Semester. Honoring his parents was killing him. And, you know, I'm sure some of the motivation came from inside of him, but a lot of it had to do with Bobby trying to honor to his eternal credit, trying to honor a longtime family tradition. This is true in many of our homes, right? Still, I think there are a couple of interesting things to notice about the fifth commandment. First of all, notice that this week, with this commandment, we've moved over from the first tablet of the law to the second tablet, from the God tablet to the neighbor tablet, from the horizontal dimension of our obligation from the vertical dimension to the horizontal dimension. And I want us to notice also that honor your parents is the first of that second table. This is not an accident. Remember, I said a couple of weeks ago that honor God above all is intentionally the first of all the commandments. If we can get that one right, all the rest fall into place. Love God and do as you please, says Augustine. A frightening libertarianism. Love God and do what you please, but it works. Likewise with this commandment, it's first for a reason. I'm not sure it's first in important, but it's first in time, right? Because this is where we learn first to be good citizens and neighbors, at Mama's knee. When we start wandering away from her on uncertain legs towards that lit burner on the stove, or that electrical socket on the wall, or that cute skunk in the backyard, we discover early in our lives for the first time that we did not make ourselves, and there are others who know more about the world than we. And so if we get this right, all of the rest falls into place. Every subsequent authority, every teacher, crossing guard, coach, police officer, mayor, governor, president, all of these will become in subsequent life in loco parentis for us, parents in place of our parents. And so if we can get this right, everything falls. We learn to be good citizens at Mama's knee. Or not. So the second thing I hope you'll notice about the fifth commandment is what happens to it in the New Testament. After 1,000 years of thinking about it, at least two things happen to the fifth commandment in the New Testament. It gets an extension and it gets a limit. So in the New Testament, the fifth commandment gets an extension. It gets a coda, a completion, a twin commandment. Obey your parents in the Lord, writes St. Paul to the church at Ephesus. Obey your parents in the Lord, but also, fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath. And so Paul is reminding the church at Ephesus that this is a coin with two sides. There's a reciprocity to this honoring, right? Because parents are God's gift to children, and children are God's gift to parents, no matter how difficult or ornery they are. And you know, the Ten Commandments are so elegant and shapely in their leanness, right? I mean, here is a timeless, comprehensive, global ethical code in 179 words. It's beautiful in its spareness. But of course, spare documents leave many things out. So here's a fun exercise. If God were to consult us and ask us what we'd add to this spare document, what we'd carve in granite alongside, what would we add? I think near the top of my list might be, don't hit your kids. Don't demean them with words. Never attack with language. They're God's gift. And so in the New Testament, the fifth commandment gets an extension. But it also gets a limit, right? In the Gospels have nearly no interest in Jesus' life between his infancy and his adulthood. It's one story in all four Gospels about Jesus' life from birth to adulthood. And what's interesting about this story is that in it, Jesus is not exactly a model of first century Jewish adolescence, is he? So Jesus is 12 years old, an age fraught with significance in every culture of every land and every time. Age 12, this is not an accident. At age 12, Jesus and his family traveled the 90 miles from Nazareth to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Now, in Jesus' day, the population of Jerusalem ordinarily was about 40 or 50,000 people. But with the city crowded with pilgrims from all over the world during Passover, the population swelled 3 times to 150,000. And so Jerusalem at Passover is like Wrigleyville last night. There are bleacher bums and hawkers and vendors and scalpers and parkers, and everybody is wearing blue because the Dodgers are in town, so you don't know a friend from an enemy, except that first century Jerusalem is not 21st century Chicago, and there is no purple line to get you back to Wilmette safely, and no cell phones. So suddenly, Joseph and Mary have celebrated the feast and are headed back to Jerusalem and discover that Jesus isn't among them. They're a day away, 25 miles up the road. They have to turn around, come back. When they get back to Jerusalem, they look for him for 3 days and finally find him in the temple, electrifying all the tenured professors and rainmaker lawyers in Jerusalem with his spooky and precocious intelligence. And when mom and dad scold him for an age-inappropriate, premature independence, Jesus just says to them, "Mom, Dad, love ya, but I have a higher call." You know, Jesus is Jesus. He really did have another father and a higher calling. Jesus is Jesus, and we're not. But still, this is the New Testament word for us today, too. In the New Testament, the fifth commandment is not unconditional. It gets a limit, because it's true for many of us as well. Is someone very important in your life unable to understand who you essentially are? Is there someone you love more dearly than anyone else on earth who does not understand what the universe is calling you to be? I don't know, maybe a gay son of a hypermasculine father, or a surgeon's daughter who wants to be the next Lady Gaga, or a Muslim who falls in love with a Jew. Have you ever loved someone more than life itself, and yet you knew that no matter how long you lived, you would never be able to be what they wanted you to be? They would never be honored the way they wanted to be honored. Before I perform a wedding for a young couple, I like to sit down with them for 4 or 5 hours to talk about the joys and challenges of marriage. And of course, one of the most important things always for us to talk about is how the homes we come from shape the homes we hope for. The home of our origin shapes the home of our destiny. And this happens invisibly. It happens subconsciously. So you have her lifelong expectations of what home looks like and his lifelong expectations, and sometimes they collide. So I try, at a minimum, to bring these unspoken expectations to language, or at least to consciousness. And so one question I often ask my young couples is, so what did you learn from your parents about love and marriage and being a father or a mother? What do you hope to bring over from your old home to your new home? And I still remember the young man who looked me in the eye and answered my question without thinking about it. The only thing I ever learned from my father is that I didn't want to be like him. And I was a little surprised by both his honesty and his certainty, but I sort of knew his father, and I couldn't disagree with him. And for this young person, respecting his father was just impossible. I don't know if it was his father's fault. I don't know if it was his fault. It just, sometimes that's the way it works out. This is a very fraught command. As simple as it looks on the surface, it's fraught with complication. So in the New Testament, this commandment gets both an extension and a limit. It's not unconditional. And still, it's the lifelong task of every child to honor those who brought us into this world and raised us from mewling infancy to independent maturity. And it's for those of us who are 40 and 50 and 60 as much as it is for those who are 12 or 18, maybe more so, because at some point in life, those we were so dependent upon in childhood become, in turn, dependent upon us in great age. And so those who raised us up by our hands to untried legs and then watched us walk away from them, in turn might be needed to be helped to their feet by us. All my life's a circle. Harry Chapin used to sing, all my life's a circle. Have you read this beautiful novel by Lisa Genova called Still Alice? They've made a lovely little movie about it as well, with Julianne Moore as the titular protagonist. And Alice in novel and film is a Harvard neurologist. And then very early in life, around the age of 60, Alice is struck with early onset Alzheimer's disease. And so this is another of God's cruel jokes, a neurologist struck by a common form of dementia. And Alice understands exactly what's happening to her memory and her mind. She has a front row seat to her own mental decline. And her memory lapses come in fits and starts, right? There are days when she recognizes her adult daughter, Lydia, and there are days when she can't really place. Lydia looks familiar, but she can't really place who Lydia is. And one day, Alice says to her daughter, Lydia, you're so beautiful. I'm afraid of looking at you and not knowing who you are. And Lydia says to her mother, I think, Mom, that if you don't know who I am, you'll at least know that I love you. And Alice says, what if I see you and I don't know that you're my daughter, and I don't know that you love me? And then Lydia says, then I'll tell you that I do love you, and you'll believe me. How many of us have been exactly there? One last thing, and then I'll quit. My friend Max recently retired from a 40-year career as a lawyer in New York City. And now that he has a little free time, he's going to concentrate in his retirement on two things he neglected while he was working 80 hours a week. He wants to concentrate on religion and golf, not necessarily in that order. Max is Jewish, but he married a Jewish girl. And I guess it would be fair to say that his Jewish faith was not all that central to most of his life. He's an accomplished chef. He usually serves me bacon in every dish he prepares. So now it's time to concentrate on the two things he's neglected all of his career, golf and religion, and sometimes he finds them in the same place. My friend Max lives in White Plains, New York. And summer before last, 2015, somebody gave Max tickets to this professional golf tournament in Westchester County. And Max went, and while he was following the golfers from fairway to fairway, he got intrigued by this one golfer. And he got fascinated by her backstory. And he started following her all around the 18 holes. Her name is Brooke Henderson, and she's 17 years old. She's Canadian. And summer before, I think she's a pro now, but summer before last, she hadn't even turned pro yet. 17 years old, she placed 5th in this LPGA tournament that Max attended. And I don't think this is true any longer, but summer before last, her father was her caddy. And when Brooke would line up a putt, her father would stand behind the hole, take the pin, pretend this is a flag, stand behind the pin, and he would just, without saying a word, he would point where she needed to hit the ball. Not say a word. He said, this green is going to break about 18 inches to the right, so hit it right about here. My friend Max says that when she was successful following his direction, things went perfectly. And when she failed, not so much. So my Jewish friend Max knows the Ten Commandments, right? He said this was for me a living vignette of the fifth commandment. Follow your parents' direction, and your life will be long in the land the Lord your God gives you. And ever since Max told me that story, as I look back on the life that I have lived, I see my father standing behind the hole, and he's pointing the way. And I'm thinking, when I was successful going that direction, things really worked out for me. And when I failed, not so much. And so I hope the same was or is for you too. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, amen.